Good evening. On behalf of the Addison County Regional Planning and its Energy Committee, I welcome you to this evening's presentation focusing on best practices for siting solar arrays. It's been heartening to see the rapid pace at which Vermont is developing larger renewable energy generation facilities spurred by statewide incentive programs. But if the construction of sustainable energy generation is to be itself sustainable, we need to ensure that projects are developed with sensitivity to our rural aesthetic and the needs and values of our municipalities and citizens. Some of us are old enough to remember that there were some excesses and errors made in the first round of renewable build-out in the 80s. Fortunately, most of us are more attuned to the necessities for renewables at this point in time, and maybe we can avoid some of those mistakes. It's of the utmost importance that we get it right this time and develop a consensus set of standards so that we can continue to drive forward. Tonight, we'll begin with a very brief look at perceived issues with recent and current projects in New Haven from Jim Walsh from the New Haven Planning Commission and our Energy Committee. We'll then hear from Joanna Miller, who's with VNRC, the Vermont Natural Resources Council, and Administrator of VCAN, the Vermont Climate Action Network. As an advocate for environmentally sensitive solar development, she'll address solar best practices. Next up will be Billy Costner from ANR. Billy is in the Office of Planning and Legal Affairs at ANR. He'll discuss guidelines they are developing for solar development. Then we have Derek Buretz from Encore Redevelopment. He's VP for Development at Encore. He'll be talking about market factors driving the current situation for solar and some of Encore's approaches to developing projects. We've got a lot on the program, so without further ado, let's get to it. Actually, I'd like to ask who is in the room tonight first. Johanna has asked me to see if we have Town Energy Committee members here. If you're a Town Energy Committee member, please raise your hand. Planners, town planners, and regional planners, developers, concerned citizens. Great. Well then, now, without further ado, let's get started. I give you Jim Walsh from New Haven.
I have a mic there.
You need this. Yes.
Thank you. The mic's going to be for back there, so I'll have to speak louder for you.
You have to flip it around because it's rubbing on your shirt. Or just flip it on the other way. No, but with the thing.
Flip it 180 degrees.
There you go.
There we go. Okay, so we'll start with New Haven. This is some slides I've taken of all the spots that we're aware of that are in the process of being thought about, applied for, or CPGs issued.
Could you speak up, please? Yeah. I hear you.
Okay, so these are the shots in New Haven, okay? We'll start right now. This is Route 7, right in front of the Middlebury Fence Company. So, zoom ahead at them. And that's the spot that's proposed. That's a shot back south towards Middlebury. That's actually from a person's side lawn. So go ahead again. And that's another shot where they're putting it. This is 150 kilowatt location. There's going to be 2 here. This is Norris is across from Greenhaven. They're CSAs. So you can go ahead. I got some of these are GPS located and some aren't. The GPS are taken the 10th of October. Some you'll see in here are taken just yesterday, so you can see the change in what happens in 2 weeks. So go ahead, Adam.
So on the right-hand side, you have their basically overall location. So this one is on Route 7 in New Haven. You can see it there, and then you're looking, and you said this was across from Greenhaven, right?
Yep, correct. And that's the spot for the second one. The first one will be down in this area. And that's what's changed in 3 weeks. We've got a road in, and they're getting going.
The same site.
Same site. This is across the road from there. This is just south of the State Police Barracks in New Haven on Route 7. And this will be, I debated how to do this. So I went straight up Route 7. Didn't go by developers. I didn't go by size. I just went straight up the road. So this one's, this is a 150, and this is going to be the benefit of the Otter Creek Lodge at Otter Creek. And you can zoom again. That's from Route 7. That's the State Police Tower. And one more. And that's looking north from there. That's the State Police Barracks and Greenhaven behind it. And we can go ahead again, Adam. This is Denali's. Is that how we pronounce it? Denali's property, I think, in New Haven. It's just before you get to Benner's Homestead. I date myself now. Tortorelli's. That's just before Tortorelli's on the west side of the road. And you go ahead again, Adam. And if you want to, at any point where you see a GPS thing, we can zoom in, and I can give you a road view of 360 if you're lost. So if you want to do that after the meeting, I can click on that and I give you a 360. This is across the road from Tortorelli's. That was a proposed spot. I don't know how that's going. And go ahead again, Adam. That's another shot where there was some thought process. I don't think anything's happening at this point. This one is down here. This is Misty Knoll Turkey Farm. This is to benefit the food co-op in Middlebury. That one's went in about 2 months ago, or 3 months ago. It was a while ago. Go ahead, Adam. That's what it looks like close up. And we can keep going. This is a little further north on Route 7. This is before New Haven Junction. This is on the east side of Route 7. And the flagging is for this area. Yep. That you're familiar with. That is cross-pollination. That's in New Haven on Route 7 now. And that's another shot of it going north. Close up, that's just it. And
Cross-pollination again, looking south.
yep, exactly. This one is a new one. It's popped up in the last couple of weeks. It's going right in here. Proposal for it. It's a 150. I'm not sure who that is. The paperwork. That is across from. That's Rita Buska's house. I don't know if you know Rita Buska, and that is that used to be Millie's Dinette. That was.
So it's just north on Route 7 of the
Yep,
cross-pollination.
a couple hundred yards. Yep, exactly. That's where it's going to propose to be set. I think the flags and stakes are in here. That's top of Woodman Hill. This is actually in Waltham. It's on Route 7. That's top of Woodman Hill going into Virgins. That was taken 10th of October. It was completed, and I think if you do the next one, you can see the screening. And that's the change in the last 3 weeks. That was 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago. And
This is the next site on the top of Woodman Hill.
correct. Yep, right beside it. And that's yesterday. So they go fast when they go.
So that's October 10th,
Yep,
and that's yesterday.
yep.
Same site.
Different shot at the same site. Yep. We're familiar with that one. That's in Ferrisburg, Virgins. This one is proposed in New Haven. This is off Sawyer Road. This photo is taken going east on 17 towards Bristol, and that would be looking north. And that's a
And the site will be where?
right there, just behind that barn, just behind this barn here, in that area. That's a 5 megawatt one proposed. That's 40 acres. That's the cornfield that's in now, or that's the cornfield that's there now.
This is Sawyer Road again?
Sawyer Road, that's looking southwest. That's looking southwest. And again, Sawyer Road, yeah. This one is on Field Days Road. This one is a 2.2 megawatt proposal. And just to the left of that barn is where that proposal is. You can zoom ahead again, Adam. That's another shot of the area. This one is 150 kW. This one's going to be off-takers town of Middlebury. That one's the land there.
Is this also on Field Days Road?
Correct? Yep.
Okay, so the town of Middlebury has a planned array in New Haven, but the college does not, is that
Correct.
correct?
Yep.
Okay.
And that's a shot of that field to the southeast. And that's straight south on Field Days Road. And I think there's a panorama here. Yeah, there you are.
So you're on what road?
Field Days Road.
Field Days Road.
That's a panorama looking to the east.
Okay.
That's just east, or just west of New Haven Village on 17. And you can go ahead, Adam. And one more. That's looking due east on 17 towards the village of New Haven. Bristol Cliffs are over in there. This field is under proposal, or in conversations. Zoom by that. That's personal. That's a site that where the things are supposed to be going. I don't really want to put that up at this point. Keep zooming. That's Foster Motors. That's just on Route 7.
In Middlebury.
Yep. And I think there's one more, two more. This one's in Whiting. This is actually, I've cheated on this. This is Route 30 and Addison County lines there, so this is actually Rutland County. I can see Addison County from there. I can see Bristol. I can see Bristol from there, actually. And there you are. That's the end of it.
Same place?
Yep, same place.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great, good. Well,
Shut
thank
that-
you for helping us kind of set the scene as to some of the
Yeah,
things
yeah.
that are going on in
Pull it up there on
Addison
the right.
County for solar.
There you go. Zoom her down. There you go. Thank you.
All right, great.
Yeah.
Good.
A lot of projects.
I should.
And New Haven seems to have the bulk of. That's a question I wanted to ask as well. Jim, how many projects in New Haven?
Discussion anywhere from discussion to completion 14. The one on Field Days Road is 2.2, possible same developer with another one, possibly a third one side by side, so it'd be 3 2.2s in a row, but one for sure now.
So 14 projects, and they're ranging in size from,
150 to 5 megawatts.
150 kW to 5 megawatts. Great. Maybe in the overall Q&A after we're done, we'll have a chance to talk about some of New Haven's issues with the project. Seems to be the epicenter of PV development in the county. Johanna, I believe you're next. Take it away.
This way?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah? Okay. My PowerPoint is up there if you don't mind.
So, the
That-
next one down.
Next one down. That being said, as you're pulling it up, so just for a little context and based on the conversation that's happening tonight, I might move through the PowerPoint fairly swiftly. So let me just introduce myself. Jeremy gave a brief introduction, but I'm the Energy Program Director at the Vermont Natural Resources Council. We're a statewide education and advocacy organization. We're based in Montpelier, but we have members all across the state of Vermont. We have been around for over 50 years. We are founded by farmers and foresters who understood that the health of our landscape and our environment were inextricably intertwined to their livelihoods and our economy here in the state of Vermont. So we are historically a land use policy organization, an environmental protection organization. We care a lot about and work on natural resource protection issues in a variety of ways. We have 4 programs: a forest and wildlife program, a water program, a sustainable communities sort of land use smart growth program, and then, as I noted, I run the energy program. So we care a lot, again, about, keeping Vermont's communities, vibrant and intact. We care a lot about protecting Vermont's natural resources. We care a lot about advancing community solar and other kinds of energy efficiency, conservation, and renewable energy solutions for a variety of reasons, not only because it's good for our economy, but also because we have deep concerns about climate change for future generations and the responsibility that we have as sort of this living generation to think about folks down the road. So that's why we've been very active in energy issues in a variety of ways. So one of the things I just wanted to also talk about in terms of setting the tone for what, my work at VNRC is that I do serve as the coordinator of the Vermont Energy and Climate Action Network, which is the informal but growing network of town energy committees. I see a couple of you in here tonight. Oftentimes we do regional roundtables with RPCs, and it's more focused on bringing energy committees together to talk about energy efficiency projects that they're doing and biking, bike and pedestrian initiatives, that sort of thing. I've been doing a lot of work as of late on thinking about community solar and solar solutions, because a lot of these grassroots groups and a lot of communities are very interested in getting their, municipalities and getting their, just people in general off of fossil fuels, which are getting increasingly expensive and are really wreaking havoc on the planet. So there's been a lot of focus on doing that in a variety of ways. So we've been focused on energy efficiency projects, and this Saturday is the Button Up Vermont Day of Action. So if you're not doing anything, please learn more from me or turn to Laura, because we're going to be buttoning up Vermont. But one of the things that I do is put together sort of model sort of programs. That's our goal, is to help grassroots groups and communities understand and move forward on advancing solutions that, again, are good for sort of our clean, renewable energy future, but also good for communities. So one of the things that Adam asked me to do here tonight is talk a little bit about some of the community solar tools that I've been putting together. And I put together this PowerPoint presentation for another event as of late, but I'm going to move through it kind of quickly. I talk about community solar. The definition of community solar is essentially, for the way we're thinking about it, is community solar for municipalities. You talked about the town of Middlebury going solar. That makes me happy. My mom's a Middlebury High School graduate. But also, community school projects, that sort of thing. But community solar, so anyone who can't do it themselves. So 70% of Vermonters can't put solar on their own roofs. They rent their house. They don't have solar access. So we're putting together a guide for them. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I'd happily talk to any of you and offer you some of the resources that we have if you're interested, because some of the tools I've been spending a lot of time with putting together, working with Public Service Department, the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, and a lot of communities are things like a model request for information. So if your town wants to do a solar project, you might want to set the tone and lay out your goals and put that out there into the world in terms of exploring what kinds of projects you might want to partner with developers on. So I'm not going to go into all this, but we have things like that. If people are interested in shepherding a community solar project in a way that works for you, and in partnership with a potential third-party entity like a developer. Vermont has a lot of great developers, and that's one of the things I'm hoping that folks who are concerned in this room can, sort of learn a little bit more about in terms of, and developers can hear from you about how do we all work better together so that we can advance shared goals but not do it, in conflict, hopefully. So this is a bunch of the stuff that we have if anyone is interested: model power purchase agreements, model land lease agreements, member operating agreements for neighborhood group net metered projects, 5 to 7 Vermonters coming together around a project. But one of the things that I have also put together, and I'm not going to go into too much of the details because Billy is going to talk a lot about, and because I borrowed heavily from what the Agency of Natural Resources has put together in terms of tips in terms of siting solar projects. But I did just want you to know, because I work for an organization, as I said, that does care a lot about protecting natural resources and protecting our communities and getting the benefits to communities and to individuals. We do believe a lot in good practices and good neighborly conduct, and I have 2 pieces of takeaway materials that I would leave for folks. I have them over here, which is just one is just citing solar guidelines, good practices, and permits, and that's what Billy's really going to get into, and you will see that I have borrowed from the agency's great information. And then secondly, a more generic tips and guidance for projects that you might have a school that is interested in doing a project. And it really talks through basically the steps on how to do that, as well as talks about, very key considerations in terms of appropriate layout, how you should think about, and tips for engaging your communities around, advancing those kinds of efforts. So I just wanted to lay that out in a general framework. I also wanted to just note 2 other resources that if folks are not aware of, I know that the Planning Commission is, but we put together an energy planning guidebook for Vermont municipalities, and this is about how do you strengthen your town plan in a way that both safeguards a variety of different values and goals, but also advances clean energy projects, conservation, transportation alternatives, that sort of thing. That's a tool that we have that is available here. And like I said, I probably won't go into too much of this because this is really nitty-gritty. This is a model solar contract that we've been working on for municipal and school-based projects. So if anyone's interested in that, that is available, but I don't necessarily need to go into all those details. I guess I just would ask you to fast forward to the last slide, if you don't mind. These are just some community solar success stories. Again, I can't share with, but the last, keep going. It just has my contact information on it. And I just want to make sure if anyone wants to get a hold of me or VNRC for any of this, it's also in some of these guidebooks. So I think I would just turn it over to Billy, though, who will really get into the nitty-gritty of the siting stuff.
Before we do that,
Absolutely.
Johanna, we have State Senator Chris Bray with us, who stopped in and would like to just speak for a little bit before he moves on to his next Station of the Cross. So, Chris, here you are.
Oh, so I don't need any devices other than
For the TV.
oh, for the TV. Oh, all right.
Yeah,
So,
if you can clip it to your jacket down about here.
I want to comply with that request because I was hoping that Dick would be here so that I can watch the entire meeting later. So I'll start with an apology. Before I learned of this meeting, I'd already made a commitment elsewhere, so I'm going to have to leave very shortly. But I'm looking forward to watching the show, following up with people, and hearing about this discussion. So I serve in the State Senate. I serve in the Finance Committee, which regulates, amongst other things, the Public Service Board. So I'm very aware of the Public Service Board process or role of the Department of Public Service. And I think in a nutshell, I just want to reassure people that the Finance Committee, the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee, is keenly aware that as the energy portfolio of the state of Vermont moves from being heavily reliant on nuclear and fossil fuels to more renewables, as well as using weatherization and efficiency steps, that we want to create a positive pathway forward that enables Vermonters to make choices for themselves about what that energy future looks like. And I think it's a very exciting time. It's also a challenging time. We haven't really had to think about a lot of these things for most of my lifetime. Energy arrived in sort of mysterious ways. It came over the wires. Who knew where it was coming from exactly? Now we're shifting to distributed generation. And the thing that goes along with, so we have a model in the Public Service Board that says, in a centralized place, we are going to make decisions about how the state develops energy projects. And yet, and that was probably a good fit when we had a relatively small number of large utilities bringing forward large energy projects, sort of centralized energy projects as well. Now we're going to distributed energy, but we still have a development and approval model, Public Service Board, Department of Public Service, which is centralized. So there is some tension between developing distributed energy all around the state and yet still relying on Montpelier to sort of quote-unquote know best. And I'm not saying know best to belittle the work in Montpelier. Very talented people work as hard as they can to try to make the best possible choices for the state. But there's a distance between a centralized authority and all the towns. So things going on in Addison County, there's no way for that those folks to be as tuned into it as all of you here. So to wrap up, because I promised I'd only speak for 2 minutes, was that I know, I'll speak for myself, but I'm confident that other legislators feel in a similar way. We want to be productive partners, connectors of individuals, municipalities, regional planning groups back to Montpelier to help adjust our planning and development process so that we stay in sync, so that we stay, our plans are more harmonious. And I think that's the, so I know that there are some challenging things going on right now. There's also, exciting things. The sort of the flip side of the challenge is that it's exciting to see that people are really making many steps to try to make the move away from fossil fuels to cleaner and more renewable energy, as well as weatherization efficiency. So I'm here to say I'll be listening to the show, and I'll be happy to be talking with people, and I'll be staying in touch with town planners and regional planners, individuals who are affected by projects. And if I had to pick one word for what I'll hope we'll all keep in mind is to work respectfully, because that's when Vermont is at its best. So thank you very much for the chance to say a little something, and I wish us all well.
Thanks for stopping by, Senator Bray. So now we have Billy Costner from A&R.
Good evening. I'm Billy Coster from the Agency of Natural Resources. I'm going to stand if you don't mind. I've been sitting much of the day. And I work in the agency's Office of Planning and Legal Affairs, and that name doesn't really necessarily suggest what we do, but what I spend most of my time doing is helping to coordinate the agency's regulatory review of energy projects. Somewhat traditional development projects in Act 250, but these days increasingly energy generation and transmission projects, because as you all have been discussing, there's been quite an uptick in development activity in those areas. And I've got a lot of information that ranges about the overall permitting process, the agency's role, some specifics about solar siting, and I'm going to try to click through those all relatively quickly, because my sense is that the real value in this meeting is going to be in the conversation and questions you folks ask later, and some of the larger questions that Senator Bray just rose. So stepping all the way back, why renewable energy is really a focus of the Agency of Natural Resources is because it's an important step in mitigating the impacts of climate change. The effects of climate change on Vermont and the world are important priorities for our agency to deal with. Typically, there's two ways to try to address climate change. One is through preventing the things that cause it, reducing the emission of greenhouse gases through burning fossil fuel, for instance. So that's where renewable energy is a key mitigation strategy. The other charge of our agency is helping the state adapt to the inevitable changes of climate change. Even if we reduce our emissions significantly, the climate is changing. We're already seeing some of those effects. So we need to protect the natural infrastructure that we have, like stream buffers and wetlands and forests that help us adapt to those changes. Next. So those are kind of the two avenues that we're approaching that issue from. And as I said, renewables is a key mitigation strategy, and we need to protect the rest. Next slide, please. So largely, the environmental regulatory system of Vermont is somewhat designed to do both. One is the Public Service Board process is set up to permit and deploy these renewable sources, but then there's a whole body of more traditional environmental regulation that's looking at protecting those resilient features, the landscape scale features that protect us from the changes that are coming from climate change, and also provide habitat for wildlife, recreational lands for hunting and fishing, clean water, clean air, all the things that Vermonters expect and enjoy. So our agency is trying to manage and balance both those goals when we're looking at these projects. But it's a really challenging reality, as you're all facing. There's a lot of new development in the energy sector happening. There hasn't been a real increase in capacity at the regulatory level. Our staff has not increased, the Public Service Department, other folks who are charged with looking at the impacts and benefits of these projects haven't increased their capacity with the rate of new development. So that's something we're trying to deal with. And the Public Service Board has instituted some recent rule changes that have really expedited the regulatory review process for certain scale renewable projects. So it's a challenging environment to try to make those difficult balancing decisions. But we're working on it. And the theme I'll come back repeatedly to tonight is a key strategy in addressing those challenges is early engagement. For developers to come speak to myself and other regulators very early in their process, to speak with neighbors, to speak with planners, municipalities, to really not be afraid to have those conversations as early as possible, because they're inevitable. So, our advice is to just, put things on the table and get started. Go ahead, Adam. So just a quick overview. Most renewable energy projects, solar included, well, all energy projects require a certificate of public good from the Public Service Board. That's the umbrella statewide permit that these developments need, comparable to an Act 250 permit for larger traditional developments. The Section 248 certificate of public good process before the board is broken out into a number of different pathways that are more expedited depending on the scale and complexity of the project. So I can talk about that more later if folks have questions. But basically, the biggest, most complicated projects take the longest amount of time. The smaller projects take less. And then many of these projects also require other permits from our agency. If they're going to impact state significant wetlands, they might need a wetlands permit. They may need a construction or operational stormwater permit. So these are permits that basically control the amount of discharges of pollutants into the waters or airs of the state. This is kind of traditional environmental regulation. So in addition to that certificate of public good, many of these projects need these other permits, which have their own opportunities for public comment and involvement. Next slide, please. So focusing on the Public Service Board process, which is really the main one, it's got a few phases. There's this period of pre-development when developers are working with landowners, try to identify sites for their projects, hopefully talking to communities, getting a sense of kind of what the opportunities and obstacles they may face with that site are. And once they've kind of had those conversations, hopefully identified and resolved issues with abutters, with our agency, with others, and they think they've got a project that's viable for the community, then they basically officially notice the project. 45 days before they have to file their application, they're required to send notice to abutters, to regional planners, municipal planners, and whatnot. Then at any point after that, they put in their application, which is basically a big raft of pre-filed testimony. It's sworn information that says, this is what our project is, and this is how it meets the standards of the Public Service Board. And then once that happens, there's, for the larger projects, a formal proceeding that follows where there's opportunities to do discovery and for different parties to engage in a largely a quasi-judicial process that culminates in a board decision. For some of these smaller projects, the 150 to 500 kilowatt solar projects, they usually lack that formal proceeding. Typically, the developer puts in an application, there's a 21-day period for folks to comment, and unless people who comment raise significant issues with that project, the Public Service Board is free to just issue a permit after that comment period closes. So it's a very tight window for folks to mobilize and share their thoughts with the board. And then just, again, our cloud permits, I spoke about them earlier. Many of these projects, in addition to a CPG, may need some permits from A&R. So go ahead. So again, depending on your perspective on whether deployment is appropriate in your community, I think regardless on what side of the issue you are, that the most successful approach is to engage with people early, is to pick a good site, first of all, that doesn't have significant natural resource constraints, where it ideally is accepted by the community, close to three-phase power, all the things that make the project viable. But then to really reach out to key partners and make sure that they're aware of what you're doing, and then to really be thorough in the information that you provide to the public, so people who do want to participate and engage have the information available to them right off the bat, so they're prepared to do that. Go ahead. This is the main environmental standard in Section 248 that the Public Service Board looks at, and it's very broad, and I'm just going to read it because this is the main thing that they're making decisions on regarding the environmental criteria. That the project will not have an undue adverse effect on aesthetics, historic sites, air and water purity, the natural environment, the use of natural resources, and public health and safety. So from that large set of general considerations, the board narrows down their decisions to make sure that these projects don't have an undue adverse impact. They're supposed to consider some Act 250 criteria that is relevant, but it's not determinative, and there's basically a whole body of precedent that the board draws from in making these decisions. But that's the standard that at the end of the day, any new energy generation project needs to meet to be permitted in Vermont. Next slide. So looking at those resources from a solar siting and an energy siting perspective, the things that we're seeing come up most frequently as challenges for finding good sites are on this list. Many of the places where solar is most appropriate are large open areas that are relatively flat, don't have a lot of trees around them, and many of those places are in river valleys, because in Vermont those are generally the most flat and open areas. And it's fine to develop in river valleys. We see that all over the state, but we've learned through Tropical Storm Irene and through a number of different experiences that you really can't be as close to rivers as maybe we traditionally have been. So the legislature and our agency has taken a number of steps over the past few years to try to restrict how close folks can actually put permanent structures near rivers. So these solar projects are being proposed at a time when those rules are in transition. So sometimes we're seeing them proposed closer to rivers than we would like to see, because they could cause a risk to themselves and to be flooded downstream in flood events. Again, wetlands are protected by state law. Wetlands are not always the obvious cattail marshes that you see. They can be just wet areas in hay meadows that have been hayed for many years that agriculture allowed in, but other uses like development and energy are not. So that's an issue that we often have to grapple with. Likewise, there's many rare, threatened, and endangered plants that grow in old hay meadows and on field edges that you might not realize as a farmer managing that land, but when a project comes in for this sort of regulatory review, we look for, and sometimes projects need to be adjusted to accommodate for those. We're also concerned about development bringing invasive species in. This is more relevant for transmission, the transmission component of a project. If you have to run a new power line several miles, that could act as a vector to bring invasive species someplace it isn't. And then just the whole idea of bringing transformers and other pieces of utility equipment to areas where maybe they wouldn't typically be, like along a roadside. We're trying to figure out the best ways to manage and protect natural resources from potential spills. And there's ways to do that, but these are all things that folks just need to think about when they're planning the project. And then there's just a whole other range of smaller potential wildlife issues that come up. Go ahead, Adam. So given all these potential natural resource concerns, a developer, a concerned citizen, folks, they need information so they can figure out what's on a piece of property so they can plan for it. So we're trying to make a lot of our information available to the general public, both the development community and just folks who are interested. We have what's called the A&R Natural Resources Atlas, which is an online tool that includes many, many different layers of natural resource data. It shows where many of the wetlands or river corridors, significant natural communities, wildlife habitat are across the state. So that's a good planning tool when you're looking at potential sites for development. We're also available to developers, landowners, concerned citizens to actually look at a piece of property and do a desk review and share our feedback on what values might be there from a natural resource perspective and what constraints might be there for development, and provide just general technical assistance in that regard. And we're also in the process of compiling written siting guidance for solar projects. Given just the high volume of new development we're seeing, folks with varying levels of experience doing land use development in Vermont, we felt that it's really important to put a resource out there for citizens and for developers where all this guidance is in one place. So that should be hopefully coming out later this year. And this is just a screenshot from that Natural Resources Atlas. You can see it shows a large deer wintering area to the lower right, a river with a floodway and some wetlands surrounding it. So this is the sort of information that any of you can access just from your home computer and drill right down to your own property to see what resource constraints may be there. Next slide, please. But at the end of the day, the burden is on the applicant, the developer, to meet that standard before the Public Service Board. So, it's really their job to figure out if they're avoiding natural resources, if they're proposing a project that makes sense from a rate and interconnect perspective, that they're addressing concerns of local town plans and regional plans. So that is their responsibility. But the process does allow for other parties to participate and engage. Next one. So, just kind of going back to the theme of this, though I'm not sure the conversation will stay on this theme, but looking at the best ways to site renewable energy and solar, the most important thing is to pick a good site, one that works from a production perspective, one that is, safe from a natural resource and public safety perspective, and one that ideally works for the surrounding community. To do that, it's important to engage with all potential parties as early in the process as possible. And that the reality is the Public Service Board process is a challenging one. It's either very fast or very long and expensive. So trying to reach out and identify issues and resolve them amongst the potential parties before you even start that process is really in everyone's interest. And finally, our agency is a resource for you all, folks who are interested in developing your own projects, community solar projects, or folks who are concerned about what might be going on across the fence from your property. We're happy to share what we know about the natural resource features across the state. So that's it for me. Certainly if you have any immediate questions right now, or we can just hold them till the end. Thank you.
Wow, no questions. You must have been very quick. Next up is
Thanks, Jeremy. All right. So there might be a slideshow function if you got a view. Yeah, and then full screen mode. Down a couple. Yeah, try that. There it is. Technology. All right. Great. Thanks, folks, and Adam and Billy for a pretty summarized conversation of a very complex matter. I think it's great to see this group and this platform of folks on a local level come together and really exchange ideas and understandings of a fairly complex issue. My name's Derek Moretz. I'm Vice President of Development for Encore Redevelopment. We're based in Burlington. We are a developer of community-scale solar projects. Our background is in brownfields and contaminated sites and redevelopment, hence Encore Redevelopment. But we're now working with schools and towns and municipalities and investors, contractors, utilities to to develop solar projects on properties across the state. So many of our projects are for the public sector, schools, universities, hospitals, towns. Others are for private institutions. So why don't we dive right in? This actually, real quick, is a picture of a project we developed here in the area. This is the project referenced at Misty Knoll Chicken Farm in a collaborative effort with Middlebury Foods Co-op as the electrical off-taker. So Encore, I just mentioned. Next slide, Adam. Based in Burlington, we did develop some of the earlier net metered projects in the state. First 150 kilowatt, first 500 kilowatt net metered project right here in Middlebury, as well as the first cooperatively owned project also here in Middlebury. And I'll go through some of the case studies. So next slide. Why so much solar in Vermont? 5 years ago, we may not have been having this conversation, but over the last 3 to 5 years, you've seen really a result of years of legislative achievements and a response to Vermont's requests for cleaner, cheaper, more affordable, renewable energy. That was evidenced through the SPEED program, or standard offer, which was a 50 megawatt solicitation to really advance and deploy the renewable energy that was available to the markets. That was up to 2.2 megawatts, which you've seen several of here in the Addison Valley. That 50 megawatt SPEED program is really shrunk to only a handful of projects per year. So I think you'll see that kind of wind down or taper down moving forward. In its place is this net metering program maxed at 500 kilowatts, so a half a megawatt, roughly 3 to 4 acres per project across the state. And as Billy mentioned, there's a separate permitting process for projects up to 150 kilowatts or up to an acre or so, which I think are a number of the projects being proposed here around Addison County. You have federal incentives through tax credits and depreciation benefits. Many of those are expiring in the end of 2016, so you do see a short-term ramping of these technologies to be deployed in that window. You do see decrease in panel pricing and other equipment that support these the projects. In the last, call it 10 years, we've seen the equipment pricing decrease at least fivefold. You've seen a long-term escalation of electric rates with utilities looking to diversify their energy portfolios between Vermont Yankee shutting down and exposure to natural gas pricing and out-of-state large-scale hydroelectricity. Utilities such as Green Mountain Power are looking to stay ahead of the curve and use local distributed generation to reduce their exposure to some of these other out-of-state and often dirtier forms of energy. And coincidentally, peak shaving is the value that utilities have for solar electricity, whereby the times of day that the solar energy is here is generally the times of day that the utilities and customers use the most electricity. The renewable portfolio standard you'll probably be hearing more about. Most states have an RPS which requires a certain percentage of electricity to come from clean energy resources. Vermont right now has a goal, but not a requirement. We're looking to work with folks across the state to really identify what Vermont needs as far as an RPS. Innovative financing, there's been a lot of progress in this space to allow consumers and residents across Vermont and across the U.S. to access clean, affordable solar energy that may not have a south-facing rooftop or access to some of the complex financial models. So moving forward, Adam, why so much solar right here in Addison County? It's clear that this area in the Champlain and Addison Valley is some of the prime solar resource in the state. We have large tracts of flatter, open space. We actually recognize this area as the banana belt. Folks out of Vermont maybe not so much, but it certainly does have a higher radiance or solar resource than other areas in the state. And we also have a pretty sturdy network of three-phase electric distribution. I'm going to talk briefly about some of the challenges and criteria that we look at as a developer when identifying sites for feasible development, and one of them is interconnection. And Green Mountain Power does have a pretty solid circuit or a network of circuits through the region that support solar development, and also why you see a lot of these projects closer to population, closer to town and state roads, because that's typically where the three-phase power is located. So moving forward, some of the other site selection criteria that we use, Billy mentioned environmental resources and constraints. That's probably the largest in that the A&R always has a seat at the table as we permit these projects towards the certificate of public good. So wetlands, endangered habitat, species, the list goes on and on. I think Billy captured it. Interconnection feasibility, I just mentioned, there's a process separate than the Public Service Board whereby we submit the application to the utility. They run their own impact study to determine what upgrades may be required, whether the project may or may not be feasible. And that's a parallel track than the CPG. Land value is critical. Many of these projects afford a modest lease payment to the landowners. Depending on the regions, may dictate what the value of that land may be and whether or not the project can sustain that. Geotechnical considerations, if there's shallow bedrock, it's a serious challenge in that we need to have ballasted or concrete foundations, whereas if it's deeper soils, we can drive posts into the ground, and it's simply more affordable. Site access, constructability, somewhat speaks for itself. Access to state roads, access to interconnection, just all the things that would drive up the cost of construction. Cultural resources you don't hear so much about, but behind the scenes we do engage archaeologists, particularly for the larger projects and sensitive areas, to do cultural resource assessments. And I actually skipped over aesthetics, which is probably the largest one that we're here to talk about. For the projects, we deploy, especially between 150 and 500 kilowatts, we engage aesthetic impact consultants to do their own analysis, which is submitted to the Public Service Board and the department for consideration. And on projects, varying types of mitigation is deployed, be it vegetative screening, planting evergreen or deciduous plantings to soften, if not screen, the entire project. Generally, screening 100% of the project is nearly unattainable, but certainly softening of the view sheds is a means of mitigation, site selection probably being the largest. So moving forward, these are a few case studies. A lot of folks ask us, why don't you just build on rooftops, or why don't you just build on brownfields or landfills? And there's a reason for it. This is 230 kilowatts that Encore has developed in Burlington across the city schools. and they certainly have their challenges. Although there's no environmental or aesthetic impacts, they are less productive. We have to situate the panels flatter to the roof, whereas on the ground we can pitch them to capture more of the sun. The structural integrity of the roof is critical. The warranties, these projects last quite a while. The panels are generally warranted for roughly 25 years. They're expected to produce for well up to 40 years, whereas the roof warranties may not be as long, so there's an apparent disconnect there. So certainly do have their challenges. Moving forward, this is a project we commissioned on December 31st of last year in some Arctic environments. This is at Virgin's wastewater treatment plant, 150 kilowatts, although broken into two separate arrays. Certainly had its challenges. Ballasted concrete foundation due to the soils, a fairly expensive network upgrade to the system there, but at the same time there was no real higher and better use of the property. It was on a wastewater treatment plant in an industrial district. Moving forward, this is at the Burlington International Airport. This project's currently under construction. 500 kilowatts on the parking garage of the airport. Fortunately, there was some vision behind the expansion of the parking garage. They installed a lot of the infrastructure needed to support the solar array, so the development and construction was much more streamlined. I guess moving forward, number 4 is the South Burlington landfill. This is an earlier stage of development in South Burlington. This is a landfill project, and we can tell you firsthand they have their own challenges. Certainly no higher and better use of the property. However, there's some serious regulatory and construction and economic constraints of doing a solar on a brownfield or a landfill. I'd be glad to discuss those in more detail. This is our last one here. This is a project down in the town of Bennington, 500 kilowatts. It's on an old fill site that material from Hurricane Irene out of the local rivers were placed at the site. So there's about 15 feet of fill rubble across a 5-acre site that we're deploying a ballasted system. It is along Route 9, and I think relevant to some of the concerns here is, we've got 3-phase power along Route 9. We've got a site that is conducive to solar development. How can we marry the concerns of all the constituents? And in this case, we heard the neighbors, we heard the town, and their concern for visual impacts and mitigation, and we put together, with the help of our aesthetic and landscape architects, a planting or mitigation plan that screened the northern array. You can't see so well here, but there will be some evergreen and deciduous plantings between Route 9 and the array that, at least from a line of sight, will soften some of the impacts. So certain low-hanging fruit can be deployed to blend these projects in with the landscape. So I think that's most of what I had. Actually, here's some photos of some other quick case studies. This is the Middlebury Acorn project we commissioned in 2011, 150 kilowatts on a brownfield behind the Middlebury Police Barracks. This is 150 kilowatts in the town of Randolph, commissioned last year. And this is a project not far from home here. This is was developed by Middle Road Ventures, a local development shop with support of Encore, in a collaborative effort with Middlebury College. This is a 500 kilowatt array. I think this is a testament to site selection in that, visually, you've got Cane Road, or Creek Road, excuse me, over here. You've got some existing vegetative buffer between the receptor and the site. As well, to the north, an existing tree line that separates the Lodge at Otter Creek from the site, as well as some additional screening between the neighborhood road and the site. So this is a model community scale solar project in our opinion. I believe that's the bulk of it. Conclusions: responsible, well-sited projects are generally more expensive. Rooftop projects and landfills and brownfields are more expensive and difficult. So we're working with folks in the state to provide legislative support for those more challenging sites. Larger projects will taper off, as the senator mentioned, and really as the industry distributes towards these locally sited, smaller scale generation projects. Moratoriums certainly aren't the answer. There's not much progress going that route, but certainly having these open house discussions are a great opportunity to exchange ideas and feedback. So with that, I'd probably turn it back over to Jeremy and open it up for questions.
Great, I'm sure there's some questions out there. Would anybody like to start it off?
You mentioned that on rooftops there's challenges, and I suspect that that's because of the angle and you've got space constraints. So, for instance, the solar panel that's in front, the one behind it, if it's at, say, a 30-degree angle, it needs more distance. So therefore, if you flatten that, you allow to pack more on a rooftop, and so that's the trade-off. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that's it. There's that, and then the structural element, which many of our buildings across Vermont were designed to handle snow load plus the live and dead load of the structure, but not an additional 6 pounds per square foot of say a ballasted solar panel. So yeah, it certainly is less productive, more expensive, but
structural and warranties being the second issue.
Right.
Thank you.
Yes? I've been told that if we leave the mic here, it should pick up everything successfully if we turn off the fan.
Thank you.
I had a question for you, Billy. I was interested to hear about A&R working on a solar siting guidance document. I know Town of Rutland has one. I'm on the Middlebury Town Energy Committee, and we're starting to work on one. Can you talk about how, if individual municipalities develop their own suite of siting standards, how that might interface both with the standards the state's producing and the CPG process?
Sure. So what we're developing is actually a multi-agency guidance document that takes the comments and recommendations that we typically provide to the Public Service Board on these projects and consolidating them all in one place. So they're very specific to the regulatory framework of the Public Service Board. So they don't get into side setbacks or aesthetic screening or things of that nature. They're really about avoiding regulated natural resource impacts. So hopefully that can be a resource in those other arenas, but that's the main focus for primarily the development community, but also for folks who are just interested in how to site those most effectively.
Peter?
What percentage of the state's load is now getting to be generated by these projects? In other words, how much nighttime load will the utilities have to provide, which is an unbalanced situation because they want to keep their generating machinery running at the same level all the time, and then if they have to cut way back during the daytime because you got all the solar, then they have to crank it up at nighttime. So what percentage are you getting to, and what's the problems with the utilities with that?
I mean, it's different for each utility, but one of the reasons, so the program that makes most of these projects happen is the net metering program, and just this past legislative session, the legislature raised the cap on that program because in most every utility district, they had either come close to or exceeded that cap. It was 4%. in Green Mountain Power, where you are. But in Washington Electric Cooperative Territory near where I live, they're at 10% net metered. So, but in terms of that sort of, it might give you a little bit of a flavor. It's not the whole picture.
Yeah, 10%, that's on a capacity basis. When you look at energy, solar does not produce all of the time, nor does wind, but the benefit of solar, as I mentioned, was it does match the load profile of utilities in general. So although it's not being utilized around the clock, it's generally matching the load of the utilities. But certainly it does require other dispatchable forms of generation. But if we're able to wind down the diesel generators overnight, or excuse me, during the day, then obviously we're displacing some fossil fuels, which is a direct benefit.
And Derek, that's because we've become a summer peaking state at this point, right? Which is just when solar is
that's a good
producing.
debate going on. I mean, Vermont is a dynamic climate, and certainly in Addison County, where you may have more of a peak, a summer peaking utility may not be the same in other parts of the state. But as I understand, GMP, especially in the Champlain and Addison valleys, are certainly summer peaking.
So I see the core question as how do we decide if there are undue adverse effects on aesthetics, and who gets to decide that?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really curious about your aesthetics consultants and how they approach that.
That's a great question, and one perhaps beyond my expertise, but I'll give it a shot. And maybe Billy could chime in here too. I mean, to testify in front of the Public Service Board, you really do need to be an expert. I could not go to the board and opine on undue adverse impacts to aesthetics as far as what's undue, what's adverse. But generally speaking, a project can have adverse impacts, but if they're considered not undue, then they can still be issued a certificate of public good. So I don't know if I answered your question, but the Public Service Board ultimately looks at whether the benefits outweigh the costs. So the benefit of having a solar project in the state of Vermont versus the adverse impacts and whether they're undue. So I don't know if you can maybe address it.
Just from a kind of procedural perspective, there's folks who are visual experts, visual consultants in the state. There's actually David Raphael, Landworks in Middlebury. He is an aesthetics consultant and testifies before the Public Service Board on these sorts of cases. It's also something that's considered an Act 250, and there's a longer history of dealing with aesthetics in Act 250. And through Act 250 precedent, something known as the Queechy test was developed, which basically says is something is unduly adverse if it shocks and offends a normal, I forget the exact language, but they've tried to quantify what undue adverse aesthetic impacts are, understanding that people generally might not like the way things look, but that there's a certain level that it's so out of character for the community that it is really unduly adverse. And it's a soft science, but there is a standard that they try to hold folks to. And typically, a developer will have a aesthetics consultant provide testimony about the project. The Public Service Department, which is another statutory state agency that participates in these proceedings, they will often hire a consultant to represent the state on that question. Abutters, other parties might get their own experts to weigh in, and then ultimately the board has to decide. So
I would add that the project size matters in that up to 100 or 500 kilowatts, that's where the full pre-filed testimony and expert testimony is required, whereas projects below 150 kilowatts do enjoy a somewhat expedited process without quite the level of scrutiny and testimony provided. So.
And can you remind us what happens above 500?
Sure. So for above For projects between 150 and 500, the applicant still has to file largely a full petition. There's certain criteria that are waived, but they have to put in a full application, and then there's a brief period for parties to comment, and if they don't raise significant issues, then that project moves forward. For anything above 500 kilowatts, then typically there's a full board proceeding. So the applicant still files their petition, but then there's this quasi-judicial process that plays out. The board convenes a conference, a pre-hearing conference, where people who are interested to intervene as formal parties can make themselves present to the board, and you can actually become a party to the proceeding. Then there's several rounds of discovery that all the parties can serve on each other about that pre-file testimony, basically asking questions about where you came to your conclusions, what documents you used to support that. Then all the other parties who are part of that proceeding are required to put in their own testimony, basically responding to what the applicant said and making their own arguments whether the project meets the criteria. And there's several rounds of that. Then ultimately there's a technical hearing, which is kind of like a trial, where the Public Service Board calls witnesses, and folks speak to their testimony, and the board can ask questions, and then ultimately there's a decision. So that can take anywhere from 3 to 6, for larger projects, 10, 18 months. So for the larger, say 2 meg solar projects, those usually take 3 to 6 months, probably, and they follow that more quasi-litigious proceeding.
I have a related question, and on Exchange Street, Middlebury, we see a number of tracker projects. I don't know how big those are in terms of kilowatts, but I think that the public seems to have a strong reaction to them because they're higher, there's no screening, they're close to the road, and we're struggling, to figure out how to respond to those kinds of projects. Can you advise us?
Well, you might. Those are probably even smaller than 150 kilowatts in many cases, and those are more a residential scale project where it's a very expedited process before the board. They don't have to fill out a full petition. It's more like an application form. I don't know, that's up to 15. Yeah, I don't work as much with the smaller projects, so I can't give you great advice on that. I'm sorry.
It sounds like your question or comment is more directed to the technology. I mean, they certainly are larger. They're spaced further apart because they need to avoid shading from one panel to the other as they track across the sky. So although it is solar, it's a different type of solar. So I'm not sure really how to respond.
But should towns and the county have a role in having some criteria for those? Citing criteria.
I think, as Billy mentioned, it's just important that folks present the information in their applications. If it is, say, a tracker, it should be acknowledged that it's a tracker. If it's fixed, it should acknowledge that it's fixed, and try to provide some dimensions or description of the equipment being used.
Billy, can you expand on that?
Yeah, so just kind of stepping back to something that Senator Bray mentioned. Energy permitting in the state of Vermont is done at the state level, and unlike Act 250, where there's most projects that go through Act 250 still need to get a local zoning permit, subdivision permits. There's a local process in addition to that state level review, but for energy transmission and generation, it's primarily done at the Public Service Board. And the history to that is because most of the projects they considered were long transmission lines that span many towns and were necessary for reliability purposes. You needed to keep the lights on, and trying to have a town-by-town conversation about whether those projects were viable just really wasn't going to work to get those things permitted, and they were necessary for us to transmit power around the state. And there were these one single large generation facilities that were really vital from a reliability perspective. As we're seeing more and more of, there's distributed smaller scale generation. Those decisions are still being made by the board at a fairly high state level. The board has to consider town plans and consider regional plans, but they're not if they conflict with the project, the board can still award a certificate of public good. There's certain aspects of a town plan that carry more weight. It's the conservation measures of a town plan. So if you've identified certain areas in your community that are conservation lands or particularly protected for those reasons, then I believe the board has to consider those in making their decisions. But the board still looks at town plans. They still certainly carry weight. And I know a lot of communities have tried to engage with Joanna and her colleagues to try to put guidance in their town plan saying, we like well-sited renewables, we support renewable energy, it's important to our future, but we want to have some influence on the scale and location and how those renewables are deployed. So I think there are opportunities for communities, even given the Public Service Board state level permitting, to try to influence their decisions through town plans. And even more importantly, if you have a clear statement in your plan or some of your own criteria, good developers like Derek will read those, will have those inform their siting decisions when they're looking around in your community. If you said this brownfield or this area behind the industrial complex is a great location for renewables, you know, that's where folks like Derek and his colleagues are going to hopefully go. If you said this is a really important place for our community, we don't want to see development here, they'll hopefully honor that as well. But it sounds like at least Senator Bray is considering having a conversation about whether that statewide level of permitting is still appropriate.
Just to clarify, Billy, a town or a municipality has automatic party status in any one of these proceedings before?
I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to say it, but I don't believe that they do have automatic party status. They are required to be given notice of these projects, and then they can petition the board to become a party. And I don't know of any instance where the board has not allowed a host town in as a party to a proceeding. So you have to make an affirmative ask, but typically it's granted.
And what's your sense of the importance that testimony on the part of a town carries with the PSB?
So, in my experience, where towns have been most involved have been with larger generation projects, like utility scale wind farms. And typically the town is the host to that project, and in many cases supportive of it because of the benefits that that project will bring to that community. I don't know of a ton of examples where towns have been parties and opposed a project and how that's worked out. I haven't seen many towns engage with these smaller net metered projects other than provide comments to the board, you know, share their perspective with applicants, but I don't know, you guys may know better than I, but there hasn't been a lot of formal municipal involvement, I believe, at this scale of development.
Jeremy, I'll speak a little bit to that. As a member of the Moncton Select Board, we certainly get notices of every residential solar project that gets done. We have a chance, we do sometimes talk to the PSB, put comments in, because these residential electric, as currently by statute, they don't have to really pay attention to our zoning. So they can cite things closer to boundary lines that we might want, and so we will talk to that. Certainly there were changes made in the past year. Act 199, I think, spoke to transmission lines giving due deference to legislative bodies in towns. And I suspect that there will be some legislation going forward, I hope, to give towns at least a little bit more of a say in how things are cited in their town. A little bit more local power would be not remiss, I guess, to say.
I just want to correct something I said. There has been a recent example where municipalities have engaged as parties to transmission proceedings, a natural gas line in this area. So out of respect for all the really significant hours and work that folks have put into it, towns have participated. I think they've made a difference in the proceeding. You should talk to your neighbors about who are part of that if they thought their voices were heard by the board. But certainly towns were involved in that proceeding.
I have a question for Derek. During your presentation, I get the sense that the cost of a project, the expense is a very important criteria.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like it's more important than putting a project off in the middle of nowhere where no one sees it. So my question is, can you explain the investment criteria, return on investment? What happens when a project costs more, electricity costs more, or does the investor get less? You want to walk us through that?
Sure. I think at a high level, it's pretty straightforward and simple in that, if the project is not a good investment, then it generally will not be deployed. In other words, if investors can put their dollars elsewhere, say in a treasury bond or in the stock market, they're generally going to do that.
What's your return on investment criteria?
It ranges. It's
no doubt.
Yeah, it certainly ranges. I mean, you're looking at treasury notes of 4 to 6%. I can tell you solar's not much beyond that, and certainly comes with much more risk than a long-term bond. So it is very high-risk dollars to get projects from conception to commissioning, and much less through operation. So it's a very dynamic spectrum. I mean, when we look at projects, we look at costs of interconnection, we look at the regulatory risk and costs associated with seeking certain permits, and at some point it simply doesn't make sense. I think what we look for as a developer is certainty in the risk profile. If we come to a site, we engage A&R to say, is this wetland, is it not wetland, or is it, does it check all of the boxes? And aesthetics is a difficult one, as you mentioned. It becomes subjective. We quantify it to the extent possible, but we're constantly looking for a permitting process that provides investors and other stakeholders with the certainty they need to get to the finish line.
So it seems to me like the external cost, which is the thing that this lady was speaking to, it's not part of it's not in your financial calculation. That's getting off to somebody else.
Well, I mean, we model it to the best we can. We certainly can model the hard cost, of equipment, network upgrades, etc. But the ones that are difficult are the lawyers and the folks back and forth litigating projects, which is where we try to stay out of. Those are the projects that you generally see not get built.
I have a twofold question. Is there a place where members of the general public can go see could go see the applications that have been filed with the PSB for projects of any size?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that. I would encourage you to go to the Public Service Board. By request, you can seek any certificate of public good, and I believe application.
After it's awarded.
That's after they are awarded.
Okay,
That's
gotcha.
my understanding.
Gotcha.
And that is problematic,
Understood.
it seems to me.
That's a good point. So, by the board requirements, for projects less than 150, the applications go to the neighboring abutters, the select board, the planning commission, and the statutory parties such as A&R and the Public Service Department. I would say the town hall and the regional planning commission is probably your best bet on finding an open door with a copy of those applications. I know the board is working on a database that does have applications and proceedings that are available online, but right now it's difficult to track until they're issued the CPG.
Yeah, I asked the same question. It's frustrating for me even to try to figure out, to get a handle on the numbers. For the larger projects from 150 and up, we typically have them on our website. We post the petitions as we receive them on a website that the agency maintains, so I can provide a link to Adam for that. And we try to include all the additional testimony from other parties and whatnot. So, but we're really pressing the board to make that, you know, given the amount of activity in the space, they really should have this information available to folks.
The second part of my question is, does anybody know of any projects of any size that have been denied by the PSP?
Solar projects?
Solar projects. The question is PV solar projects?
Yeah, I know projects that have been abandoned because of challenges getting a CPG. I do not recall any that have been denied, but certainly many that have been applied for have not gotten CPGs for one reason or another.
Sir, in back.
I have a question that the answer kind of affects me on two fronts. On one front, I own 400 acres of flat land in Addison, and I figure I could probably power the whole town. I don't know how you could ever put a project like that together. And on the other front, I'm a facilities director for a school district, so I have some interest there. My question is, how do I find the right developer and the best deal for me? There's 20, 30 people pounding on my door all the time.
Yeah, I would be glad to talk to you afterwards. I think Joanna's probably best positioned to provide a non-biased answer.
I didn't mean to go through my presentation so quickly. It just seemed sort of random what I'm talking about here as opposed to what you guys are concerned about. But one of the things that I do have, one of the many tools that we've developed is an example request for information, a request for proposal and we have links to different venues and a cadre of all kinds of different Vermont developers who you could put that out to and say, I have this, size of a parcel, I have these goals, I have these concerns and, considerations for my community or whatever it is, but I want to explore options. And so that's where those sorts of tools could be helpful. And I would happily talk to you. I don't, I work with a lot, I think Vermont has a lot of great solar developers who do want to do well by communities and also not just in it for the buck, but I'm just grateful that there are a lot of good developers here who do want to try and do the right thing, but also realizing that we all want to turn on the lights, we all want to go into the grocery stores, and we all need these basic services that electricity and power provides our communities. So how do we do projects in a way that fits with Vermonters' goals and interests and individuals' Vermonters' goals and interests for their own parcels of property, but do that in a way that works as best as we can for everyone. So I'd happily share with you some of those examples and talk to you a little bit more about how I think that might be done, and then link you to potential other folks who have done something similar potentially.
I'd like to follow up on that myself, because one of the criteria, it seems to me, for siting is proximity to three-phase power. And I know that when we did a rooftop 50 kW project in Ripton, on top of the Ripton School, we managed to do it without tying into three-phase. Is there a threshold at which that approach is not viable?
Yeah, there certainly is. At 50 kilowatts, you can connect to single phase pretty easily. At 100 kilowatts, you begin pushing it. At 150 kilowatts, you certainly are pushing it. So I think any project in the 150 kilowatt plus range are generally connecting on three-phase. We've seen a few go through on single phase, but they're few and far between, and it needs to be a robust single-phase circuit.
And what qualifies as proximity here? How much distance to three-phase is practical?
Generally, the utility has certain thresholds. I want to say it's 2% load losses, but if you're going much further than that, then you've got to have really large conduit, which is quite expensive. So it depends on the project size. 50 kilowatts, not very far. For 4 megawatts or so, obviously you can go further. And the scale does matter, so it can support that cost.
And Jeremy, just specifically, I'm just going to make a plug for some of the tools that I did bring, and Adam actually did make some copies, thank you. And one of the things in one of these tool documents speaks to the interconnection issues and rules of thumb in terms of access to three-phase power for different scale of projects. And so I do just want to encourage people to grab a couple of these so we don't waste the paper, and I do believe they might be a little useful.
Great, thank you. Sir?
Yeah, I'm just curious, like, if you're looking long-term, I mean, to what degree can you anticipate changes in technology when you're picking, best practices? I mean, in 10 or 20 years, will we look back and say, oh, this whole class of energy developments was a mistake because the technology makes... I mean, I don't know how good your crystal balls are, obviously.
I still wish it was really good. But what I know, just even anecdotally, is that there are several folks who have had, been producing solar for decades now. And their warranties, for 20 years, and they're still 40 years in, they're still getting solar. And it was a big investment back then, but man, they've recouped it now. And I don't, so I don't know what that future looks like. The thing that motivates me and what I see is that fossil fuels they're finite, and they increase pollution and all those things. So moving towards clean energy solutions is probably inevitable, and technology is evolving. You saw Derek's slide up there about the cost of solar panels dropping significantly. Technology will continue to evolve, but here's the other thing: why you're seeing, and I just want to stress this, part of the reason you're seeing the solar moves so rapidly right now is all of those different incentive programs really sort of coalesced all at the same time. And then secondly, the investment tax credit for solar is about to expire in the end of 2016 and or be significantly reduced. So people are moving very quickly to make those investments. Technology probably will evolve, but I think we're talking about a technology that they have warranties for products that are 25 years, and I think you're going to recoup that investment.
I'll take a quick add-on there in that, the panels right now are warranted to degrade about 0.5% per year. So after, 20 years, they're still operating at 90% efficiency. Will we have panels in 20 years that are more efficient than we have today? Certainly. But these projects are designed to endure, Vermont wind loads, Vermont snow loads, and we kind of make capital improvement decisions with the information we have today. Same as buying a new car or investing in windows for your house or buying a new cell phone. But we haven't seen the rapid efficiencies in solar panels that we see, say, in cell phones or other computers. I mean, it's generally the same technology as we were installing in the early 80s, and those panels are actually still working quite well today. The density and the power that you get out of each module is improved, but the general technology is practically the same.
Just from an environmental perspective, what we're looking at in permitting these projects is the impacts today and what we anticipate changes over time. So making sure they're out of places that we think are going to be threatened by changes to natural resources, and protecting areas that are important for wildlife movement and other things in the future. So we're trying to look ahead from that perspective as well.
One last item before I move on is while it is a long-term investment, 25 to 40 years, we should be clear that it's not a permanent investment. We have some concerns about prime ag soils, et cetera, and it's valid, but we're not permanently altering Vermont's landscape. This is a relatively shorter-term solution in a longer-term problem. So while it is a long warranty period on the panels, it's not a permanent fix to the problem.
While we're predicting the future, it seems to me, Derek, on one of your slides, you had a bullet point that said that these larger scale projects are going to be tapering off. quite soon, and I didn't really understand the reasons you cited
Yeah,
there.
so I
Can you
think Joanna
expand on
just
this?
mentioned one is the investment tax credit on a federal level. That sunsets at the end of 2016. You've got the Vermont net metering policy, which will be reaching our maximum allocation at some point in the next few years. The 50 megawatt speed program, which was really a catalyst of deploying these larger 2.2 megawatt projects, that's faded away essentially. So, and then just the penetration to the grid. If one project goes in, it may prevent the opportunity for a project next door to go in based on saturation levels of the grid. So I think you'll start to see larger projects taper moving forward.
Ross?
Thanks, Jeremy. There was a quick reference there to prime agricultural land, and I'm just wondering, with so many of these projects going in on farms or are planned for farms, what is preventing or considering, is there any policies in each of the speakers' organizations? Do you address prime agricultural land, or is it just a concern that we all have, but there's really no meaningful way to address that concern?
Well, certainly, prime ag soil is an important resource for the state. It's limited. There's only so much of it. There's not more being created anytime soon. We work closely with the Vermont Agency of Agriculture. They don't typically participate in these proceedings, but we try to kind of carry the flag for them. And I think their general position is try to keep solar off of the best farmland. But if you are going to put solar there, do it in a way that has the least impact in the short term and no impact in the long term. Make sure there's a decommissioning plan, so after the 20 or 30 years when you're pulling those posts out of the ground, that the topsoil is still on the top and where it should be, that you're not doing things that would prevent that land for having utility for agriculture in the future. They're also trying to find ways to incorporate ongoing management in solar. I know there in Virgins there's some sheep grazing in one of the arrays, so I think you don't want to have goats, you don't want to have cows, but maybe you can have some sheep. But I think it's a real concern, especially in the Champlain Valley, where so much is tied to the agricultural economy. It's such an important resource that is protected. There are, as Derek said, there is some compatibility in that you're just driving posts in the ground, which can come out in the future. But in that 20-year period, you are losing access. So I think that the goal is to try to really limit the amount of solar on the best agricultural lands. But there aren't any strict rules or laws. The board has to consider it, but it's not like an Act 250 where you have to not impact it.
So Jeremy, I wanted to bring this back a little bit to some siting constraints and try and answer Laura's question a little bit. I think I put together a great panel, but I realize I'm also a little weaker on aesthetic siting than I thought I might have been. So I reached out to David Raphael, who is a local landscape architect, before the meeting, and I was hoping he might be here. But I guess he put together a couple of different questions for me to ask of you, and a couple different ideas. So for on-site, what can towns, what can the Regional Planning Commission do as far as siting constraints? Well, for a specific on-site targeted area, we can talk about no skylighting, making sure you're not looking up at a structure and it's basically showing against the sky. We can talk about setbacks from roads and neighbors. We can talk about screening, especially the north or the back side of the project, where it's not going to interfere with the functional utility of it, and perhaps breaking mass. So not screening the entire thing, but breaking up the mass of the project on the sides. Especially where they're visible from public areas. We can talk about basically putting them close to other larger scale industrial buildings where they fit in better. So the project at Misty Knoll is a good example of that, where it's sited real low and it's back from the road and it's behind some barns, and you have to look for it to see it. We can talk about using natural hedgerows. Basically that exist in our agricultural landscape, and making sure that we tuck things into there. We can talk about basically having a standard that makes property owners share the burden or the aesthetic burden of their projects, so that they can't site them all the way on the other side of their property where it's only going to bother their neighbor and not themselves. So there are some kind of concrete standards we can write into different plans to help us at the Public Service Board as we're dealing with this. One of David's questions to me, and it's an interesting one, is kind of the landscape scale impacts of these, or the cumulative impacts of these projects that are much more difficult. And I did not have a really good answer for him, because our permitting process is really set up to look at each individual project as it goes forward. So I guess I'd like to throw that question out to our panel and see if they have any thoughts or for us, and then throw it out to you all as well.
I think it's a great question, and I can speak to it from a developer's perspective, in that the Public Service Board has defined how they treat separate facilities versus the same facilities. If a project is, say, on the same property, and it's considered the same project by the average viewer, then they're considered one project. So they have different thresholds, whether they're considered one project or separate facilities. Certainly, context with the surroundings gets back to the question. If you're slating one project near an industrial park, then it's more in context with its landscape than the others. But yeah, I think the board has some framework of looking at one project in isolation or two projects as one, but probably not on a regional level, right? It's usually typically on a more micro scale level.
Yeah, and I guess conversely, I think there is some precedent with the board looking at the cumulative impacts of large-scale ridgeline wind facilities. There's two permitted and operating up in the northeastern part of the state. There was at least one other proposed. And I know that the Green Mountain Club raised some questions about the cumulative impact to the long-distance views, basically from the Long Trail, of having a series of these facilities down the spine of the mountains in that part of the state. So that was something that I think the board did consider in some of their permitting decisions. I don't know that it necessarily swayed them one way or the other, but those sorts of conversations you can have in this more full 248 full proceeding, where you're putting in testimony and there's opportunities to respond and have this more robust dialogue. With these smaller scale solar projects, it's an intentionally more expedited process. So I don't see the board doing that sort of cumulative analysis as much as they would for some of these larger projects.
In the back?
Well, what people aren't mentioning, and I haven't seen it in any application, anything about decommissioning. What's going to happen in 20 years, or if they get a renewal for another 20 years? Who's going to be taking care of those? I mean, are they, we already have a problem with Yankee with decommissioning. Who's going to really maintain those? What if the company, the developers go out of business? What's going to happen? We're going to be left with these obsolete, which they already are now, obsolete, these panels. They have smaller ones, but they're more expensive. What's going to happen in 20 years? Even 10 years or 40 years? Are these going to be left on the, for all of us to have to take care of with our tax-paying money to get rid of them? There's been nothing in any literature I've seen about decommissioning.
Well, it's a good question, and one that occurred to me. It seems to me that decommissioning a solar PV farm is a lot simpler and less expensive process than decommissioning a nuclear plant.
Yeah, but it is a valid question, and I would point you towards some existing statute. Any project in the state that's 1 megawatt and above, any project 1 megawatt and above is required to post a full decommissioning bond, a fully funded letter of credit, essentially same as cash, for once the project is obsolete at the end of its useful life. That money goes towards decommissioning. Other projects, 500 kilowatts, the one we worked on here in Middlebury, it was a condition of the CPG that the project is removed after its useful life. So again, projects a megawatt and above post the full bond, the letter of credit for decommissioning. Smaller scale projects have a condition, at least at the 500 kilowatt scale. And then, agreements with landowners. Generally, lease agreements have obligations, contractual obligations, to remove and restore the site to its original condition. So.
Sir?
I'd like to add a little bit. I work with David Raphael at Landworks, who does this comment about some of the ways that we've been discussing that things can be moved forward with aesthetics. It's interesting, when Billy put up the Act 248 wording, aesthetics is actually the first criteria that comes up in that statement, but currently it gets pushed down to the last thing that's looked at, and usually it's mitigated with some shrubbery or something like that currently at this time. Yet it seems to be a larger issue. And as the Public Service Board doesn't look at a cumulative effect, if they moved that aesthetics up in the where it's placed and the way that things are looked at, and we're talking about original siting, if it's brought into that original siting, then it's looked at and these things are covered. Currently, it's only a mitigation process. And this comes down to kind of permitting, where wastewater has permitting. There is no permit for aesthetics. So there's no real reason to go out there and do it first. So we're looking into seeing how that can change. I don't know how any of the panel feels that could change. And one of the other things we've done recently, in the town of Shelburne, they recently did a study on the built environment, looking at the views from the built environment and where things they want to protect. It's an amendment to their town plan that certainly will be looked at for any building that's going on there. It recently won an award, and it's a good thing for other towns to look at and see how you can prepare for the development that's going to occur in your towns prior to it happening.
Thank you. Ma'am?
Hi. I wanted to just go back to Adam's comments from David. And it sounded like, he was talking about setbacks and some of these other criteria seem to be zoning criteria. So how do you incorporate that into your town plan?
Well, you have to be more specific in your town plan. And either specifically reference the section as a section of zoning, or specifically write out those 6 or 7 criteria and whatever others that you can think of that you that I just gave you to include in the plan, so that they're there to see.
Ma'am?
It seems like when you talk about criteria, or when you talk about towns putting together guidelines, what is at issue here is that those are considered, but they're not really taken fully into account. So having that in your town plan or setting up guidelines for a town doesn't really guarantee that it's going to have any effect on the permitting process and whether or not a CPG is granted. And I think that's sort of the bottom line here, is that there was a question asked earlier about any solar project being denied, and as far as any of us know, there has not been one denied yet. So that's telling towns that even if they're going through this process, it's not really having any effect.
I can say a little bit to that, where there have been projects where things have been moved and rearranged from their original layout, where if that original layout was pushed forward, they may not have been accepted. And that's where people like us have been brought in early on. A project in East Charlotte recently was moved much further back from the road than where it currently, what it was actually proposed. And Charlotte went into this a process about doing that and seeing the siting originally for it. So there are ways to do it, and it's really coming down to thinking about it before and not reacting to things after.
Ma'am?
I think the key word here is industrial, and I don't view them as solar arrays. I view them as industrial sites, which are now scheduled. They're 14 or 15, it sounded initially, going up Route 7. Some of them were off of Route 7 in various view sheds. And when I looked at these lovely pictures, it's sort of shocking to me to sit here and think about giant solar fields taking up the visual landscape. And so I wonder if, in terms of looking at the accumulation of these installations, whether the state, whether the individual towns look at the economic repercussions, because I'm not sure we're going to have busloads of people coming up from New York to see one solar field after another on Route 7.
So this may not be an answer to that question, but I just think it's important. So I think you guys are raising a lot of important issues and concerns and considerations. And I think the Public Service Board, to someone's question earlier about whether they're hearing this, and I think there's been a very vibrant conversation as of late about responding to communities' concerns, but also communities and the state's goals of developing clean energy. And so there's a lot more awareness about that, and some exciting work that Billy's been doing with developers and other agencies and communities is an effort to respond to that. There was a siting commission that also put together, and I think Billy and the partnership of developers are looking to incorporate some of the work from that. I don't think it's necessarily easy, because I also think is the state taking into consideration the economic impact of potential downturn in tourism? They may be. At the same time, I think the state is also thinking about, the cost of transmission, and there are, the cost of, not paying for transmission, other costs to ratepayers and to Vermonters that have impacts. So as you may or may not know, there's a lot of, the nuclear power plant in Vermont is, coming offline at the end of this year. Lots of coal-fired power plants across the state or across the nation are coming offline, in part because of pollution, but also because they're old and expensive to maintain. So I'm just trying to put it back in the context of, there's a lot of things happening around this conversation, and it is indeed having real, direct impacts in your communities. You're in the hot seat, the epicenter, whether you like it or not, for a variety of reasons. But a lot of those things also will have tremendous costs to Vermonters in a variety of ways. So I would just sort of wanted to just put it back in how can we think about these issues just extremely holistically and be cognizant of what we can do on the ground, what we can't do, what we're willing to balance, but the costs of inaction too.
I would just add to it by telling a quick story that, 500 kilowatt project we developed here in the town of Middlebury. It was one of the early ones, the first one, and it was posted for public hearing in the local papers, and there was a public hearing in the police department across the way. And the only real concerned citizen that showed up was a local farmer that owned a piece of property next door, and their concern was really of the conservation and of the integrity of the soils, and they expressed clearly that they saw the solar project as maintaining the open space for the next generation. And I'd like to also just draw the analogy. A recent op-ed that was posted was making the analogy to large silos that were being installed back in the 50s and 60s, and those were industrial at the time, and those were certainly not in context of the landscape. And here we are 30, 40, 50 years later, and they are. So I think it certainly is a philosophical debate at heart, but we certainly see solar as utilizing the natural resource on a local level, but it makes for a recent interactive debate.
Yeah, I guess I'll just add quickly to that. So, it's an exciting time. There's a lot of opportunity, a lot of benefit that's coming from renewable energy being deployed in Vermont. It's going through some growing pains. It's hitting a scale and a saturation where it's affecting a lot of people. That's coincident with the Public Service Board looking at how they deal with subsidizing net metering projects. They're opening a docket on that this coming year. The Public Service Department is going to renew the state's comprehensive energy plan the following year. All these federal and state subsidies are expiring and will be potentially renewed the following year. So over the next 3 years, there's going to be a significant amount of public policy debate around the state's energy future. So, that's an opportunity for you all to really get involved and to try to influence those conversations. And you know, I would encourage, as these folks are saying, look at the big picture. You know, there's benefits, there's some challenges, there's some costs, but try to balance those and engage in those processes.
This is a great conversation. It is, however, getting late. So why don't we say 3 more questions briefly? Let's see if we can get some people who haven't participated. Jim.
A question and a comment. In regards to the decommissioning fund, can you give me, we've been told that a 5 megawatt would have a $40,000 decommissioning fund. What's the numbers you're hearing?
Yeah, that's probably a little thin. I guess one reference point that I personally have worked on was a project up in Essex Junction. That was a 2.2 megawatt facility. That decommissioning fund was short over $100,000. So call it $50,000 per megawatt, more or less. They really have a methodology of looking at the actual estimate of pulling out the post, decommissioning the road. In that case, we had prime ag soils, so it was testing before and after and adding soil additives to reclaim the soils. So,
is it Whitcomb's?
Whitcomb.
Yeah. My comment would be, we've been talking about the Public Service Board tonight. In someplace next spring, or this spring, we'll have a new Public Service Board member. And they'll go through a judicial review, pass off the Senate will approve it or disapprove it, and we'll have a new 3rd member. So going forward, you know what you got now, but you're going to have a 3rd one. So the course may vary one way or the other, eh?
I would say so. Certainly another level of uncertainty.
2 more. Sir.
I guess I'd like to know if, I read somewhere that the state of Vermont needs about 6,000 gigawatt hours of energy a year, electric. And I also read that solar to date is less than 1%. And I also read that we have a goal in the state to be 90% RE in 2050. Are we 1% or less? And what are we going to have to do to get that 90% or the solar share of that 90%? And when you do that, how much land is it going to cover?
It's going to take a lot. And I would say that we are not at the 10 or 15%, which is the capacity, but closer to the 1% today, which is the true energy production. We're looking to accomplish the 90% by 2050 as Vermont's stated energy goal to address our electric needs. But let's be clear that there's some other energy needs, specifically thermal and transportation, that our infrastructure is not exactly set up to support. So one way that solar can address those other markets is heat pumps, electric heat pumps. Whereas we may be using more electricity as we shift from thermal fuels to electric heat pumps. The other is plug-in hybrid vehicles. If we can move our vehicles down the road with electricity, that would allow us to make progress in other aspects. But the infrastructure is not exactly there yet to support it. So we have a long ways to go.
And how about the area consideration that, we're looking at New Haven right now. People are a little upset with how much ground is being covered. What's the multiplying factor of New Haven times what equals enough to make the solar goal?
I don't know that answer. The one thing I would say is that there are some entities that are doing some sort of scenario modeling and an analysis of like literally what will it take. How many electric vehicles, how many, avoided vehicles, miles traveled, how many megawatts of solar, how many megawatts of wind, and then you can equate that to a landmass. If a 150 kilowatt array is 1 acre, you could do some math. So I just wanted to just put it out there that both through an entity called the Energy Action Network, which is developing a community dashboard to give communities and individuals a sense of how much energy am I using, and how do I turn the levers up or down to A, reduce my energy consumption first, and or B, move to some other, clean energy resource to reduce my greenhouse gas emissions. So they're developing a community energy dashboard, which I think will be available probably in February or March, and then simultaneously I know the Gund Institute is doing some scenario modeling, as well as the Public Service Department is going to be finalizing its total energy study, which is looking at, okay, we have these really ambitious clean energy goals and greenhouse gas reduction goals for important reasons. How are we actually going to meet them? What does that actually mean? What are the policy pathways potentially? What are the technology pathways? So I think there are three arenas that will, sort of again go back to that conversation about big picture. There's a lot happening right now, and there may be some tools that will answer your question soon.
I can
We're
try
still
to
about 1%.
Right. I can try and quantify it a little bit. I've heard the Public Service Department say that, so going from 4% of retail utilities portfolio for net metering to 15% of their portfolio net metering would require about 150 to 200 new 150 to 500 scale projects over, so basically tripling, I don't know what the baseline is, but having 200 more of those group net meter projects to get you from 4% to 15% of portfolio. So that gives you a little sense.
So average acreage?
That's just of the retail utilities portfolio. But my understanding is that Vermont's electric portfolio is in the upper 70s or 80s renewable.
We're about 50%.
50%.
Electrically renewable right now, largely because of Hydro-Quebec.
Right. So it's not all going to
Somebody
come
else.
from. It's not all going to come from solar. And there's a lot of in-state hydro as well. A lot of the, there's a lot of older existing hydro in the state.
Last question goes to the emergency planner in the back.
But it's got nothing to do with emergencies. My question is basically, the Public Service Board is required to give due consideration to towns. It sounds like maybe they're not giving what folks here would consider due consideration. Who is, excuse the term, the boss of the Public Service Board? And how does the public get to that person to impact their instructions to the Public Service Board?
So, there's kind of two answers to that. The first is that they're intentionally supposed to be an independent quasi-judicial tribunal who can make decisions based on the facts and the law. But they take their charge from the legislature. I've heard Chairman Bowles say that time and time again. If you don't like what we're doing, talk to the legislature because we do what they say. So as new laws, new goals are created, they consider those very significantly in the decisions that they make.
Sounds like we can talk to Senator Bray about this from his earlier comments.
What I was trying to get to is that they do have instruction to listen to the local communities. And they don't seem to be doing that very effectively. So I don't think the folks in this room would be happy with following the legislative process where it's a 2 to 3 year time frame before the Public Service Board adjusts its viewpoints. I heard this gentleman say that if you just move aesthetics higher in the list, which is where it is in the law, then that would make the change. Someone is giving this instruction that says we want solar no matter what the cost to those who are not paying attention.
Yeah, I'd just mention that I would disagree that the board doesn't listen to local stakeholders in local towns and regional planning commissions. And every project we've developed where a town or RPC stands up and says, wait, we don't like this aspect of the project, immediately the board says, can you go on the record and respond to these questions or comments? The towns have been at the table as an intervener in multiple proceedings at the board, and the Public Service Board does adopt new rules along the way, and that's a public process. Every time the legislature goes to change statute addressing energy policy, that's an open door policy. So I think more and more the board is listening, and as it stands today, the the towns do have a seat at the table. Neighbors certainly can submit comments, and those comments are responded to. I can tell you that the board passes those comments back to the developers and really looks for an interactive dialogue to settle without going to litigation in front of the board. So.
And then I would also just note, as this gentleman mentioned, there will be a vacancy on the Public Service Board pretty soon. And from my perspective, I do not envy whoever gets that job, because due consideration and a lot, wrestling through precedent and a lot of very important considerations is difficult. There's, at the same time, due consideration to real life impacts and to communities and natural resources, that sort of thing. But also, with a public good of ensuring that people, have access to electricity in an affordable way. Everyone wants, to keep rates down and keep their electricity. So this is the balancing act that they're doing. And the public good is also weighing the benefits of clean energy, renewables, and over, other dirty fossil fuel energy. So it's a really tough place to be. But I do agree with Derek, and that's why I was just sort of saying earlier, is that there is a tremendous dialogue going on right now, and opportunity to see if we can do these projects right. We know that they're going to be required, and it's likely inevitable. And so how can we do it in a way that really fits with Vermonters and Vermont's values?
I think that at this point, we have to say we're out of time. It's a great conversation. This is the kind of dialogue we need to be having. Maybe we should have Dick send a copy of the videotape to the PSB. Thank you all for coming, and let's give a thanks to our presenters. Great session.